The granite peaks of the crazy mountains do not welcome the living. They merely tolerate them, until they decide the toll is due. The air at 9,000 feet is a thin, starved thing that rattles in the back of your throat like dry leaves. Aaron Hedges stepped into this vertical wasteland in September of 2014 with the confidence of a man who believed the earth was something that could be conquered by a pair of rugged boots and a map. He did not know that the mountain was already breathing him in, waiting for the moment his rhythm faltered. This is a world where the elevation and the isolation conspire to erase a man from existence in the span of a heartbeat. The silence here isn't just an absence of noise. It is a physical presence that weighs on the chest. The morning sun was a cold, white eye, peering through the jagged teeth of the ridgeline. Every step upward was a negotiation with gravity, and the loose, treacherous scree that wanted to slide into the abyss. Aaron adjusted the straps of his olive-green pack, feeling the nylon bite into his shoulders like a reminder of his own fragility. His friends were moving ahead, their voices already being swallowed by the vast, hungry distance of the Montana wilderness. He was 34 years old, in the prime of his life, and an experienced bow hunter who knew these slopes. And yet, he decided to take the shortcut to the camp, a choice that would echo through the canyons long after his heartbeat stopped. A shortcut in these mountains is never just a path. It is a gamble with the very fabric of time and space. Aaron turned away from the established trail, his boots crunching against frozen patches of lichen that looked like dried blood against the gray stone. The silence began to thicken, wrapping around his head like a wet wool blanket. He could hear the frantic drumming of his own heart, a lonely sound in a place that had no use for life. The shadows between the stunted pines seemed to lengthen, stretching out like fingers to brush against his heels. Every snap of a twig sounded like a bone breaking in the absolute stillness of the high country. The wind died with a suddenness that made his ears pop. A sickening, hollow sensation that signaled the world had gone wrong. One moment, there was the distant whistle of the air through the crags, and the next, there was only a void. This was the Oz effect. The terrifying threshold where the natural laws of the forest are suspended and the sense of being watched becomes a physical burden. Aaron stopped, his hand hovering over his compass, but the needle was dancing a frantic, meaningless jig. The mountains were no longer a landmark. They were a cage of ancient granite and cold iron. A wall of fog rolled over the crest of the ridge, moving with a speed that defied the laws of meteorology. It was not a mist, but a solid, gray entity that smelled of wet iron and ozone. It erased the horizon in 3 seconds, leaving Aaron standing in a world that consisted of 5 feet of visibility. He turned in a circle, his breath coming in jagged, white plumes that hung in the stagnant air like ghosts. Every direction looked identical. Every rock was a tombstone in the making, and the very ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. He was no longer walking on Montana soil. He was walking through a localized distortion of reality. The cold began to seep through his layers, a predatory chill that sought out the warmth in his marrow. He reached for his fire starter, his fingers fumbling with the plastic casing, but his coordination was beginning to fail. The air felt heavy, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that he could feel in his teeth. It was the sound of the mountain's hidden machinery, a rhythmic, pulsing vibration that shouldn't exist in the wild. He dropped the lighter into the snow and didn't even notice as the white powder swallowed it whole. His mind was beginning to fracture, the logical part of his brain being overwritten by a primal, screaming, need to just keep moving. Something was moving just beyond the veil of the fog, a shape that was darker than the gray world around him. It didn't make a sound as it drifted between the trees, a silhouette that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like a bad signal. Aaron called out, but his voice was flat, robbed of its echo by the oppressive atmosphere. He began to walk, then to trot, then to run, his lungs burning with the fire of 1,000 needles. He was running away from the silence, but the silence was inside him now, a cold, empty space where his memories used to be. By the second hour of the whiteout, Aaron's mind was a shattered mirror reflecting a world he no longer recognized. He found himself standing on a ledge that shouldn't have been there, staring down into a throat of darkness that seemed to go on forever. He took off his pack, the weight of it suddenly unbearable, a tether to a reality that no longer recognized him. He left it there, leaning against a rock like a discarded shell. Inside were his supplies, his food, his water, and his very survival, and he walked away from them without a single backward glance. His movements robotic and hollow. His boots felt like lead weights, dragging him down into the mountain's belly. In a fit of unexplained delirium, he sat down in the freezing slush and began to unlace them with trembling, blue fingers. His nails were dark and brittle, yet he moved with a strange, methodical precision that suggested he was following instructions he couldn't hear. He placed the boots side by side on a flat stone, pointing them toward a peak he could no longer see. Then, in his stocking feet, he stepped back into the swirling white nothingness, leaving no tracks in the fresh, untouched snow. The search teams arrived 2 days later, their bright orange jackets, a desperate, neon protest against the monochrome landscape. They found the camp where Aaron should have been, but there was no sign of a struggle, no tracks, and no indication that he had ever arrived. The bloodhounds were brought in, their noses pressed to the frozen earth, but they only whined and tucked their tails between their legs. They refused to cross an invisible line that only they could sense, a boundary between the world of men and the world of the mountain. The handlers looked at each other, the same cold dread pooling in their stomachs as the dogs began to howl at the empty air. One of the searchers, a man who had spent 30 years in these peaks, stopped and listened. He didn't hear the wind or the distant thrum of the rescue helicopter. He heard a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest, a vacuum that sucked the heat out of his very soul. He signaled for the team to turn back, his eyes darting toward the tree line where the shadows seemed to be standing too still, too tall, and too solid. He knew that the mountain had already claimed its prize and it wasn't looking for help. The discovery of the boots a week later sent a shiver through the local sheriff's department. They were found on a high ridge, miles away from Aaron's last known position, across terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without footwear. There were no footprints leading to the boots, and no footprints leading away. It was as if he had been plucked from the earth and then set back down for just long enough to leave a message. The boots were dry inside, despite the days of snow and sleet that had battered the ridge, a detail that defied every law of the physical world. Years passed, and the mountain held its secrets with the grip of a dead man's hand. Hikers would occasionally report hearing a voice calling from the high crags, a thin, wavering sound that vanished when they tried to follow it. They spoke of a feeling of being watched by something that existed in the corners of their vision, a shape that was always there but never seen. The legend of the crazy mountains grew, a dark stain on the map of Montana that whispered of the missing 411 cases and the things that do not belong in the sunlight. When Aaron's remains were finally located in 2015, the mystery only deepened into a waking nightmare. He was found in an area that had been combed a dozen times by professional trackers and high-tech infrared sensors. His bones were scattered in a way that defied natural predation, and his clothes were nowhere to be found. His skull was resting in a small crevice, facing the very peak where his boots had been discovered a year prior. There was no logical explanation for how he could have survived long enough to reach that spot, or why he would have gone there in the first place. The experts talk about paradoxical undressing, a symptom of extreme hypothermia where the brain misinterprets the cold as burning heat. But that doesn't explain the boots being placed so neatly. It doesn't explain the miles of impossible terrain covered in thin socks without a single tear in the fabric. It doesn't explain why the dogs wouldn't follow the scent or why the electronics failed in that specific sector of the mountain. There is a tear in the world in the crazy mountains, a place where the veil between what we know and what we fear has worn thin. We see this pattern again and again in the annals of the missing 411. It is a signature of the unknown, a calling card left by an entity or a force that operates on a frequency we cannot tune into. Think of the case of young Garrett Bardsley, who vanished in the Uinta Mountains while walking a mere 150 feet to his campsite. One moment he was there, a bright spark of life, and the next, he was part of the mountain's eternal silence, leaving behind only a pair of Nike shoes that were never found. Like Aaron, Garrett disappeared into the void of a high-altitude landscape that leaves no traces and offers no mercy. The Earth is not just a ball of rock and water. It is a complex, ancient machine with gears that occasionally grind the unwary to dust. We like to think we are at the top of the food chain, but in the deep woods, the rules are different and the predators are unseen. There are pockets of reality where gravity is a suggestion and time is a loop, where the geography itself becomes a predator. Aaron Hedges didn't just get lost in the mountains. He was invited into a world that doesn't have an exit. As you sit in the safety of your home, with the lights on and the door locked, remember the silence of the high peaks. Remember that there are places where your voice will not carry, and your tracks will not stay, and your technology will only show you the static of the abyss. The mountains are watching, and they are patient, and they have all the time in the world to wait for the next hiker to take a shortcut. They are waiting for the next person who thinks they know the way home, only to find that the way home has been erased. The mystery of the crazy mountains remains a jagged wound in the landscape of the American West. A reminder that for all our technology and all our maps, there are still blank spots that refuse to be filled. We search for answers in the dirt and the stone, but the truth is likely drifting in the fog, just out of reach. It is just beyond the next ridge, where the air is cold and the silence is absolute. And the mountain is always hungry for the next soul. The texture of the lichen on the rocks near Aaron's final camp was like frozen, grey lace, brittle enough to shatter under the slightest pressure. Yet it had survived for centuries in the face of the mountain's wrath. He had stared at it for hours as the light faded, watching the way the shadows pooled in the tiny craters of the stone like spilled ink. Each crevice was a universe of its own, a miniature canyon where the cold gathered like a physical weight, pressing down on his eyelids. The smell of the air had shifted from the pine-scented promise of the lower slopes to the sterile, metallic scent of the high peaks. He remembered the way his breath looked in the dying light, a series of frantic, ghostly shapes that vanished almost as soon as they were born. His pulse was a dull thrumming in his ears, a rhythm that seemed to be syncing up with the slow, tectonic heartbeat of the mountain range itself. The trees around him were stunted and twisted into agonizing shapes by the constant wind, their bark stripped away to reveal wood that was as white as sun-bleached bone. They looked like a crowd of frozen mourners, standing watch over a funeral that had been going on for 10,000 years. The sky above was no longer blue but a bruised, purple-black that seemed to press down on the peaks with a suffocating force. Stars began to poke through the veil, but they weren't the friendly guides of the lowlands. They were cold, distant points of light. They were eyes that had seen 1,000,000 men walk into the dark and never come out, and they offered no comfort and no direction. Aaron felt a wave of vertigo wash over him, a sensation that the earth had tilted and he was about to slide off the edge of the world. Every sound was amplified in the thin air, the snap of a twig sounding like a gunshot, the rustle of his own jacket like the roar of a waterfall. He became aware of the microscopic movements of the forest, the way the frost crept across a leaf like a slow-motion explosion. He was hyper-aware of his own biological processes, the sliding of his muscles over bone, the expansion of his ribcage, the frantic firing of his synapses. It was a sensory overload that preceded the total shutdown of his logical mind, a prelude to the end. The water in his canteen had frozen into a solid block of ice, a useless weight that he eventually cast aside into the brush. He watched it fall, the plastic thudding against the earth with a sound that felt inappropriately loud in the stillness. He didn't feel thirst anymore, only a strange, hollow lightness in his gut, as if his organs were slowly being replaced by the mountain air. His vision began to fringe with sparks of light, tiny, dancing phantoms that led his eyes toward the dark spaces between the trees. In the valley below, his friends would be sitting around a fire, the warmth of the flames a barrier against the dark. They would be calling his name, their voices rising into the cold air and being shredded by the wind before they could reach him. He could almost see the orange glow of the embers, a flickering memory of a world that used to be his. But that world was millions of miles away now. He was a ghost before he was even dead, a wandering spirit in an olive-green jacket, lost in the machinery of the mountains. The infrasound continued to vibrate through his bones, a low-frequency hum that disrupted the liquid in his inner ear. It created a sense of crushing dread, a biological alarm that told him he was in the presence of a predator. It was the sound of the Earth's crust shifting, the sound of the wind being forced through narrow stone pipes, a natural symphony of terror. He began to hum to himself to drown it out, a wordless, monotonous tune that was the last vestige of his human identity. The searchers would later find his fire-starting kit tucked neatly under a log, as if he had intended to come back for it but simply forgot how. The matches were dry, the striker was intact, and it was a 5-minute job to start a blaze that would have saved his life. Yet he had walked away from it, a behavior that is the hallmark of the missing 411 cases. It suggests a mental hijack, a rewriting of the survival instinct by a force that wants its prey to be defenseless. When the snow finally claimed him, it wasn't a violent act. It was a slow, white burial. He lay down in a hollow beneath a granite overhang, his eyes fixed on the grey ceiling of rock above. He watched the patterns in the stone, seeing faces and maps and ancient symbols in the natural grain of the mountain. The cold was no longer an enemy. It was a heavy, velvet blanket that was putting him to sleep for the last time. The mystery of Aaron Hedges is not just about where he went or how he died. It is about the silence he left behind. Why did the dogs fail to find a single scent in a world of fresh snow? Why were his boots placed so carefully on that high, wind-swept ridge? We look for answers in the physical world, but the physical world is only half the story in these high-altitude disappearances. Next time you find yourself on a mountain ridge, and the wind suddenly stops, and the birds go quiet, and the air feels heavy with a weight you cannot explain, do not look for a shortcut. Turn around and go back the way you came, and do not stop until you see the lights of the valley. The mountains are not your friends, and the silence is not your peace. It is a predator, and it is always hungry. Aaron Hedges is gone, but the mountain remains, its jagged peaks biting into the Montana sky like broken teeth. Every year, more people head into the wild, seeking the peace of the woods, unaware that the peace they find might be the permanent kind. Keep your eyes on the trail, and never trust the silence, because by the time you realize what it is, the mountain has already decided you aren't leaving, and the fog is already closing in, and the missing 411 list grows by one more name. This is the missing the people. It's very simple. The final word count is approximately 2,500 words.